Picture a man standing on the deck of a ship, watching the Carolina coastline shrink behind him. He knows his family is somewhere on that shore. He knows they are alive. And he knows, with a certainty that will follow him to his grave, that he will never see them again. His name was John White. For 436 years after that moment, the question was always the same. What happened to them? As if 115 people simply dissolved into the air, swallowed whole by the American wilderness without leaving a single trace behind. They did not. The answer was never a vanishing. It was a relocation, an integration, and a survival story so ordinary in its human logic that it took 4 centuries of searching for a ghost story before anyone thought to simply follow the directions the colonists themselves had carved, plainly and deliberately, into the wooden post they left behind. Most people who have heard of the lost colony of Roanoke have only ever heard of one colony. There were 2, and the first one, the one almost nobody remembers, is the reason the second one was doomed before it ever began. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth I of England turned to one of her most trusted men, Sir Walter Raleigh, and charged him with establishing an English foothold in the Americas. Raleigh was ambitious, sharp, and well-connected enough to organize exactly the kind of expedition the crown was looking for. He sent 2 captains, Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow, on an exploratory mission to scout the coastline and determine whether this stretch of the New World was actually worth the risk of a full settlement. What they found was promising. Vast natural resources, fertile land, a location with genuine strategic value, and, just as importantly, 2 Native American tribes already living in the region, the Secotan and the Croatoan, with whom the English scouts managed to build a genuinely cordial relationship before sailing back to England with their report. That report was enough. Raleigh was convinced the land was worth taking, and in 1585 he sent a much larger force across the Atlantic, roughly 600 men under the command of his cousin Sir Richard Grenville, with a soldier named Ralph Lane appointed to serve as governor once the settlement was properly established. The problems started almost immediately. Storms battered the fleet during the crossing, scattering ships and forcing unplanned stops for repairs. When the expedition finally reached the Outer Banks, their flagship, the Tiger, ran hard aground, and the impact destroyed most of the food supply they had brought with them before they had even set foot on land. Despite those early disasters, Grenville managed to establish a working settlement on Roanoke Island. He then sailed back to England with the majority of the men, promising to return with fresh supplies and a second wave of settlers. Lane stayed behind with roughly 100 soldiers, tasked with holding the fort, building out the settlement, and depending almost entirely on trade with the surrounding tribes for the food they could no longer provide for themselves. In exchange for that food, Lane's men offered European goods the tribes had never seen before. Metal tools, copper kettles, glass beads, items that carried genuine novelty and real practical value within the indigenous communities of the region. For a time, that arrangement held. The English ate. The tribes received goods they valued. And beneath the surface, both sides understood, even if neither said it plainly, that the entire arrangement rested on mutual cooperation continuing exactly as it was. Think about how fragile that balance actually was. 100 English soldiers, stranded on an island they did not fully understand, entirely dependent for survival on the goodwill of people they had known for less than a year. Every meal they ate came through that single, tenuous relationship. Every day they survived depended on it holding firm. That is the colony most people have never heard of. The one that came first, failed first, and left behind consequences the second colony would inherit directly, whether its settlers understood what they were walking into or not. And it failed, not because the land was hostile, not because the resources ran out on their own, and not because of any natural disaster beyond the fleet's control. It failed because of a single decision made by the man left in charge, a decision born from paranoia rather than strategy, that would poison the ground the famous lost colony was about to be planted in. Ralph Lane was not a diplomat. He was a soldier, and as the months wore on and the promised resupply from Grenville failed to appear, His leadership grew increasingly aggressive and increasingly paranoid. The cooperative relationship with the surrounding tribes, the single thread keeping his men alive on that island, began to fray under the weight of his own decisions. Relations with the Secotan deteriorated steadily. What had started as a functional, if fragile, trading partnership gradually soured as Lane's demands grew heavier and his patience grew thinner. The tribes had their own communities to feed, their own seasonal rhythms to follow, and the constant pressure of supplying 100 foreign soldiers on top of their own needs was never a sustainable arrangement in the first place. Then came the breaking point. Convinced, rightly or wrongly, that the Secotan were plotting against his men, Lane made the decision to strike first. He led a direct armed assault on the tribe, and during that attack, one of his soldiers killed the Secotan chief. Think about what that single act actually destroyed, not just in the moment, but permanently, for everyone who would ever try to settle on this island afterward. The Secotan were not an isolated, powerless group. They were connected to the wider network of tribes across the region, and news of what Lane had done traveled fast. The response was immediate and unified. The surrounding tribes cut off all food supply to the English settlement entirely. No more trade, no more cooperation. The 100 soldiers who had been eating because of that relationship were now starving because of its collapse. Grenville's resupply ship was nowhere in sight. Lane's men were running out of time, and there was nothing left to negotiate with. The goodwill that had kept them alive for months had been spent in a single afternoon of violence, and there was no getting it back. By June of 1986, fortune arrived in the only form it could. Sir Francis Drake, returning from a privateering expedition against the Spanish further south, sailed up the American coast and found Lane's colony in genuine desperation. Starving, isolated, and fully aware that their position was no longer tenable, the settlers accepted Drake's offer of passage home without hesitation. They abandoned the colony entirely and sailed back to England in defeat. Grenville himself returned to Roanoke just a few weeks later, carrying the resupply and additional men he had promised. He arrived to an empty settlement. No colonists, no note, no explanation of any kind. Lane had not even left a message behind telling anyone what had happened or where they had gone. With no settlers to resupply and no clear picture of what had gone wrong, Grenville made one final decision before departing. He stationed 15 soldiers on the island with a full year's worth of rations, specifically to maintain England's claim to the territory until the next expedition could be organized. Those 15 men were never heard from again. When the next English expedition arrived a year later, the soldiers were gone. All that remained were scattered bones. Here is why every single one of these details matters for the story most people actually know. When John White arrived with his colony of families in 1587, men, women, and children hoping to build new lives, they were not stepping onto neutral ground. They were stepping onto ground the previous English settlers had already made hostile through their own violence. The tribes remembered what Lane had done. The Secotan chief was still dead. The trust that Amadas and Barlow had carefully built 3 years earlier was already gone, and White's colony was never even supposed to stay on Roanoke Island in the first place. Their original destination was Chesapeake Bay, further north, a completely different location chosen specifically because it offered a fresh start away from the damage Lane had already done. The fact that they ended up stranded on Roanoke at all was the result of one more decision made by someone other than White himself. John's 1587 expedition was fundamentally different from everything that had come before it. This was not a military operation staffed with soldiers. Over 100 colonists sailed with him, and among them were ordinary men, women, and children, families hoping to build permanent lives in the New World rather than simply hold a fort until the next supply ship arrived. White brought his own pregnant daughter, Eleanor Dare, and her husband, Ananias. This was personal for him in a way no previous English expedition to Roanoke had ever been for anyone involved. His own family's future was physically aboard that ship. The plan was specific and deliberate. The colonists were to establish a settlement called the City of Raleigh, located in Chesapeake Bay, well to the north of Roanoke Island, chosen precisely because it offered distance from the poisoned ground Lane had left behind. White intended only a brief stop at Roanoke along the way, just long enough to collect the 15 soldiers Grenville had stationed there the year before, and then continue north to the intended destination. That stop became permanent, and the reason had nothing to do with the colonists' own choices. The pilot of their flagship, a man named Simon Fernandez, flatly refused to sail any further once they reached Roanoke. He cited the lateness of the season and the risks to his own return voyage across the Atlantic. Historians studying the decision believe Fernandez's real motivation was considerably more self-interested than simple caution. He had a history as a privateer, a career he was reportedly eager to resume, particularly with tensions between England and Spain escalating rapidly at that exact moment. Carrying a shipload of families further up the coast was, for Fernandez, an obstacle standing between him and considerably more profitable work elsewhere. White protested. He had no authority to overrule the pilot, and Fernandez knew it. The colonists were put ashore on Roanoke Island, the one place in the entire region where English settlers had already destroyed the relationships they needed most to survive. What they found waiting for them only confirmed how badly the ground beneath their feet had already been poisoned. The settlement lay in ruins. The 15 soldiers Grenville had left behind were gone entirely. A scattering of bones was all that remained of them. No explanation, no written record of what had happened. Just silence, and the unmistakable evidence that whoever had been left here had not survived. Despite all of that, the colonists began building. They repaired what they could. They planted crops. And on August 18th, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born on American soil. Within weeks of that birth, White and the colony's leadership reached an unavoidable conclusion. The settlement could not survive without resupply from England. Someone had to sail back and bring provisions, tools, and reinforcements, or the colony would face exactly the same slow starvation that had destroyed Lane's expedition before it. White agreed to go himself. Before departing, he and the colonists established a specific signal. If, for any reason, the settlers were forced to leave the island while he was gone, they would carve their destination into a visible post. And if they left under genuine distress, under attack, or in immediate danger, they would carve a cross directly above that destination. That agreement would turn out to be the single most important decision made on Roanoke Island during the entire history of English settlement there. Not because of what it accomplished in the moment, but because of what it would eventually tell the one man who came back looking for answers 3 years later. White sailed for England expecting to return within months. He could not have known that a war between England and Spain was about to trap him on the other side of the Atlantic for 3 agonizing years, every ship in England pressed into service against the Spanish Armada, none available for a resupply run to a small colonial outpost most of the country had already stopped thinking about. When he finally made it back, in August of 1590, what he found was not destruction. The fort stood exactly as he had left it 3 years earlier. The wooden palisades were still upright. The gates hung unbroken on their hinges. And that was the first detail that made no sense at all if you were expecting a massacre. If the colony had been overrun by force, there should have been evidence everywhere. Burned timbers, shattered doors, arrows buried in the walls, bodies, or at the very least, graves. There was nothing. White walked through the settlement in the August heat, calling out names, and the only answer was the wind moving through the coastal trees. The houses were gone, but they had not been destroyed. They had been carefully taken down, piece by piece, the way you dismantle a home you intend to rebuild somewhere else. Heavy items the colonists could not carry, iron bars, lead, cannon shot, had been left behind, some of it buried in organized pits rather than simply abandoned where it lay. Think about what those details actually tell you, taken together. People fleeing for their lives do not stop to dismantle their own buildings. They do not pack their belongings methodically and bury what they cannot carry in neatly organized holes in the ground. Whatever happened here had not happened in seconds, in panic, under attack. It had happened slowly, deliberately, according to a plan somebody had made well in advance. And there was one more detail, and it mattered more than everything else combined. Before White had sailed for England in 1587, he and the colonists had agreed on a very specific signal. If they were ever forced to leave the island, they would carve their destination into a visible post. And if they left under genuine distress, under attack, or in immediate danger, they would carve a cross directly above that destination, a simple mark that would tell him everything he needed to know at a single glance. White searched the fort for that cross. It was not there. No cross carved anywhere, no distress signal of any kind. Instead, carved deep into one of the main entrance posts, in clean, careful, deliberate letters, was a single word: Croatoan. Nearby, 3 additional letters, CRO, were carved into a tree, as though someone had started writing the same word a second time. And here is where the story turns genuinely cruel. Because to John White, standing there on that silent shore in August of 1590, that word was not a riddle. He knew exactly what it meant. Croatoan was the 16th century name for the island we now call Hatteras, lying to the south, home to the one Native American tribe that had remained consistently friendly to the English from the very first contact back in 1584. A man named Manteo, a member of that same tribe, had traveled all the way to England and returned as a genuine ally of the colony. The carved word was not a cry for help. It was a forwarding address, left by people who fully expected someone to follow it. And there was no cross above it, meaning they had not left under duress. White must have felt a surge of real hope on that silent shore. His family was not dead. They were 50 miles south, waiting for him, living among people who had been friendly to the English for years. He returned to his ship, determined to sail south the very next morning. That night, a violent storm swept in off the Atlantic. Anchor cables snapped. The ships were driven from their moorings and battered toward open water. His crew, already low on supplies and unwilling to risk their lives any further, flatly refused to attempt the short voyage to Croatoan. Instead, they turned east, back across the ocean. White stood on the deck and watched the coastline disappear behind him. He spent his remaining years in England, unable to fund another voyage, and died never knowing what became of his daughter, his granddaughter, or the colony he had governed. No rescue mission ever reached Croatoan. The one man who held the key to the entire mystery was the one man history never allowed to use it. For 4 centuries, the evidence sat exactly where the colonists had pointed. Nobody followed it. Instead, the story hardened into legend, repeated around campfires and in classrooms, and the question was always framed the same way. How does an entire colony vanish without a trace? The answer, it turns out, was never hiding. It was waiting for someone to actually look where the colonists themselves had said to look. The first modern breakthrough came not from a shovel, but from a piece of paper. In 2012, a researcher at the British Museum turned specialized imaging technology onto a watercolor map painted by John White himself, a delicate, sun-faded document called La Virginia Pars that scholars had studied for decades without noticing what was hidden directly beneath its surface. Under the imaging, a small patch of paper glued onto the map, previously assumed to be a routine artistic correction, revealed something else entirely. Beneath that patch sat the faint but unmistakable outline of a fort symbol, drawn at the exact junction of the Chowan and Roanoke rivers, roughly 50 miles inland from Roanoke Island. Think about what that hidden symbol actually represents, laid directly beside White's own written record. Before he sailed for England in 1587, White had noted that the colonists were discussing a move of approximately 50 miles into the mainland. The fort symbol on his own map sat at precisely that distance, at a river junction offering fresh water, fertile soil, and access to friendly Roanoke territory. And the symbol had been deliberately concealed beneath a patch, almost certainly to keep the information out of Spanish hands, since intercepted English documents were a genuine, well-documented threat during that exact period. The First Colony Foundation began excavating the area in 2007 at a location they designated Site X in what is now Bertie County, North Carolina. What they found confirmed exactly what the hidden map had suggested. English pottery from the correct period, colonial-era artifacts sitting directly alongside Native American materials. Not the debris of a military outpost or a brief scouting camp, but the physical evidence of a blended community, English and indigenous people living together in the same location. Then came a second, entirely separate find. In 2023, at the Elizabethan Gardens in Manteo, near the original Algonquin village of Roanoke, archaeologists unearthed Algonquin pottery dating to the 1500s alongside something that caught researchers' attention immediately: a copper wire with rounded strands. Archaeologist Eric Klingelhofer noted directly that this specific metalworking technique was beyond indigenous capability at that time. The only group in that region, in that era, capable of producing wire with rounded strands was the English. Its presence at a Native American village site, not far from the original colonial settlement, pointed toward exactly the kind of sustained close proximity contact the integration theory predicted. And then came the single strongest piece of physical evidence recovered from any location connected to this entire investigation. On Hatteras Island itself, formerly Croatoan Island, the exact place the colonists had carved into that wooden post, archaeologists discovered hammer scale. Here is what hammer scale actually is, stated plainly. When a blacksmith heats an iron rod in a forge, pulls it out, glowing red, and strikes it with a hammer, tiny flecks of metal fly off with each blow. Those flecks are called hammer scale. Indigenous peoples of this region did not work iron this way. Their metalworking traditions used entirely different techniques and entirely different materials. The presence of hammer scale at a Croatoan village site is not evidence of simple trade, a few finished metal objects passing between communities at arm's length. It is evidence of English blacksmiths physically living and working inside that village, producing metalwork on site over what appears to have been a sustained period lasting decades. Scott Dawson, president of the Croatoan Archaeological Society, put it about as plainly as anyone has. This is showing a presence of the English working metal and living in the Indian village for decades. 3 separate locations, 3 independent lines of physical evidence, all pointing in the exact same direction the carved word on that wooden post had been pointing for 436 years. Walk the full chain of evidence in order, because laid out plainly, it tells a single coherent story that never actually required 4 centuries of speculation to piece together. The colonists carved a forwarding address into a wooden post before they left. They carved it in clean, deliberate letters. They did not carve a distress cross above it, the agreed-upon signal that would have indicated they were leaving under threat or attack. The fort was intact. The buildings had been carefully dismantled rather than destroyed. Heavy items were buried in organized pits rather than scattered in panic. Everything about the physical scene John White walked into in 1590 pointed toward people who had left voluntarily, according to a plan, and had taken the time to tell whoever came looking for them exactly where they had gone. A hidden fort symbol on White's own map, concealed beneath a patch almost certainly to protect the information from Spanish interception, marked a planned inland refuge at exactly the distance White himself had recorded the colonists discussing before his departure. Excavation at that precise location produced English artifacts from the correct period, sitting directly alongside Native American materials, evidence of a blended community rather than an isolated English outpost. A second, entirely separate site nearby produced the same pattern independently. 2 locations, not one, both showing evidence of sustained English presence inland, exactly where the hidden map said it would be. On Hatteras Island itself, the very place the carved word Croatoan had been pointing to since 1590, archaeologists found hammer scale, the unmistakable physical residue of English blacksmiths actively working iron inside a Croatoan village, not trading finished goods from a distance, but living there, working there for what the evidence suggests was a period spanning decades rather than a single brief visit. And across the wider region, oral traditions from Lumbee and Croatoan descendant communities had been saying the same thing for generations. The settlers did not vanish. They came to live with us. They married into our families. They became part of our world. For centuries, mainstream scholarship dismissed those accounts as romantic folklore. The archaeology has now confirmed them directly, point by point. Scott Dawson, who runs the Lost Colony Museum on Hatteras Island and has spent years working this specific stretch of ground, stated it with a bluntness the academic world has been slower to adopt. The Lost Colony is a marketing campaign that started in 1937. It created this myth of a colony that vanished, and none of that is real. Croatoan is Hatteras Island. It is clearly labeled on the maps. There was never a mystery about where they said they were going. The mystery was entirely about why nobody followed the directions for 400 years. Now, honesty demands a genuine caveat here, because overstating the case would do this story no favors. DNA research connecting living descendants to specific colonists listed on the original 1587 manifest is still ongoing. No single line of evidence, taken entirely alone, closes this case beyond all possible dispute. Genetics gives probabilities, not photographs. A surname match and a Tudor-era English bloodline are powerful, but they cannot yet prove descent from one specific individual rather than some later English arrival. But the evidence does not stand alone. That is exactly the point. A carved forwarding address with no distress signal. A hidden map marking a planned inland refuge. 2 separate excavation sites confirming English presence at that exact location. Cohabitation pits on Hatteras showing English and native materials mingled as ordinary household waste. Hammer scale proving English metalworkers living inside a Croatoan village for decades. Centuries of oral tradition from descendant communities saying exactly what the archaeology now confirms. An ongoing DNA research linking living families to Tudor-era English genetic markers matching names on the original colony manifest. These are not fragments of a guess. These are independent, converging lines of evidence, none of them depending on any of the others, and every single one of them pointing in the same direction. In any serious investigation, that is what a conclusion looks like. The 115 men, women, and children of Roanoke were never lost. They were exactly where they said they would be. For 436 years, this story was told as a ghost story, a colony that vanished, a cryptic word carved into wood, an unsolvable mystery repeated in classrooms and around campfires until the question itself became more famous than any answer ever could. The truth was simpler, harder, and considerably more human than any of that. When the food ran out, when their governor did not come back, when England itself forgot about them, 115 people did the only rational thing left. They took their fort apart. They packed what they could carry. They carved a forwarding address into a post, and they walked toward the people who had been friendly to the English from the very first day. Some went inland, some went to the coast. They stopped being colonists and became families, woven into the same land they had once come to claim. They were never lost. We just spent 4 centuries looking for an English colony when we should have been looking for an American family. Subscribe for the next investigation.